Hello my bookish lovelies, Kira here, and today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of July. I had to check. Apparently, I'm not very good at keeping up with the months. But anyway, so I managed to read about 6 books in the month of July, and 6 books I'm going to be talking about anyway in this video. And I actually didn't have a bad reading month. It was a pretty decent reading month. It was just, I didn't really get through a ton of books, and I'm trying to make up for that in the month of August by trying to get through even more books and just, diving into it. So let's go ahead and get into the books that I read in the month of July. So actually the very first book that I read in the month of July was a DNF, and it was Foretold by Violet Lumini. And this was a book that I received off NetGalley. It was one of the ones like that they basically had it open for anybody to kind of request, and I did end up requesting it, and I got about, I think, 20% into the book, and I decided that this was not for me. This book is book 1 of the Scryers, and it's all about this girl who can see death and devastation in vivid detail. She can actually predict things that could potentially come to pass. She's a scryer, and she's got OCD and extreme anxiety, which honestly, in this book, the OCD and the extreme anxiety was very well represented. That was not the reason I DNF'd this book. The reason I ended up DNFing this book is because I did not find a lot of the side characters extremely likable, and in fact I found a lot of these side characters completely intolerable. It just seemed like the further I got into this book, the more I just was not vibing with any of the side characters. The main character was okay. I think, like I said, I think the OCD and the anxiety rep was very well represented, but she was likable, but she didn't jump out of the page at me. She wasn't something that left a really big impression on me. And actually, right now I'm having to go by the notes that I took, the very few notes that I did take on this, because I did not find this book memorable at all. And it was really disappointing because the premise for this sounded very interesting. And there was also this little organization for scryers that was kind of reminiscent to me of Harry Potter, kind of how they went away to a school where for scryers, and she meets some girl there, and this was kind of the last straw, because at this point I'm about 20% in the book, and there was another character that was at the school for scryers that also did not jump out at me, and I found her extremely annoying. This book, I feel some people will probably really enjoy this book and some people won't. I do not think that this should deter you from trying it out if that's what you want to do, but I did not like this just because I found so many of the characters intolerable. I'm gonna read exactly what I wrote as far as the DNF goes. Yeah, 26%. Sorry, I made it a quarter of the way through. I feel this book is not for me. I adored the main character and her love interest and Miss O. I loved the OCD and the anxiety rep. It felt spot on, but I didn't like any of the other characters I met along the way. So pretty much the same thing that I said. There was a setup for the Theban group, and the group itself was extremely cliche. There was her mentor Martin Pict. He was just ridiculing her so hard. I mean, she's got OCD and anxiety, and some of the things that he was kind of ridiculing her on was attacking that. And I didn't man, there was just so many characters in here that I just didn't like, and I was so sad because I thought that I was really going to enjoy this. So I did not get off to the greatest start for the month of July as far as reading goes. Sorry, my camera died, and it was full when I started. So the next book that I read in the month of July, I'm going to talk about A Reaper at the Gates. This is book 3 in the Ember and the Ashes series by Saba Tahir. This was another 5-star read for me. I just feel everything in this series is just slowly falling into place, and it's kind of got a Roman-esque type vibe, but it's got gin and a lot of intrigue, and a lot of things are happening, and I felt this book right here was what really led up to the pivotal book, which is the last book, and kind of like answered a lot of our questions. I feel like this book here started to answer some of our questions as far as the series goes, but it did not answer them 100%. And the last book, A Sky Beyond the Storm, I feel like did a good job also of like kind of wrapping up the series, because at this point I've already read it. I'm not going to talk about that one too much because that one I read at the beginning of August this month, so I'm going to wait and discuss that more next month. But I will say that I really enjoyed this, and this was another 5-star read for me because I really did fly through these books. This series has just a way of making me absolutely love these characters. Like, I get so attached. Usually it's really hard to follow a fantasy book that has multiple points of view and not feel kind of unhinged or detached or trying to reorient like after you get from one point of view to the next. I actually felt so much for all 3 of the main characters for the point of view that we were following. This series is just so beautiful, and I absolutely love it. And if you guys are if you haven't read this series and you are into like anything having to do with kind of like Romanesque type feel, like kind of a landscape with Jin and it's kind of a melting pot. Like, there's a few like different elements in here that just make like this book so intriguing and so unique. This whole series is just so good. And it is a YA fantasy, but it's well worth it, and I really love the way the characters are built up. I really love the way like that there's like all these questions like that we have, and there's like so many things like going on, and it just feels like, oh, it always just feels so action-packed and such a steady plot progression. Pacing is such a huge thing for me, and this does such a good job of pacing. So yes, I do recommend this whole series because I think this whole series is just so worth it. So the next book I listened to on audio, and it was called The Body Keeps Score: Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma by Bessel van der Kolk. And this I listened to on audiobook. This is a non-fiction book about trauma and the effects that it has on the brain, mind, and body. And I've seen this around a lot on Book Talk, and I feel like if you know anybody that's had trauma, if you have had trauma yourself, it has a lot of things in it that are very hard to digest. It takes the most extreme cases as far as like trauma goes. Like, it talks about like a lot like with Vietnam veterans who, you know, like some of these people killed children while they were in Vietnam, and they really talk about like not being able to go home again once you have done really terrible things in the heat of war. And it talks about like how a lot of times like this trauma kind of ends up defining you. It also talks about it also takes like a lot of victims that have had incestuous rape, so there is a lot of trigger warnings in this because it does go like really in depth like with the most extreme cases of trauma and how these extreme cases of trauma were affected, you know, physiologically, mentally, and emotionally by these experiences, and it really digs into it. So this book is not for somebody that's not ready to face their trauma. I do not recommend it for somebody that is looking to kind of like have like a rough summary of everything, because while it is a rough summary, it also has a lot of hard to digest content in it, because it really like goes into depth with some of the cases, because they do like a lot of case studies in here as examples of how like these particular cases were affected and how it applies to a broader audience. So what I really found like also like very useful about this book was the end of it went into detail about all of the various styles of treatment that you can get for anxiety and like how it can actually help. And I found some really interesting treatments that I've never heard before, which I really enjoyed. This book is definitely not for somebody who has trauma like that is fresh. I think this is for people who have trauma like that is kind of like a little bit like long withstanding, because I do feel like this book could be really triggering to people who are not in the right mindset to deal with the trauma that they've had. But even me, who has not had, like, has never been raped or had anything like incestuous, or has not experienced like, you know, the trials of war, who has had trauma, but like, I feel like anytime you have trauma, like no trauma is good trauma, no trauma is soft trauma, I guess you could say, because like if it's traumatic, it's traumatic. But I do feel like that there's varying extremes of trauma, and feel like even in my case, like for the trauma that I've experienced in my lifetime, this book was still very relevant, because even like in the most extreme cases, like I just found so much relevance to things that I do on a daily basis. And so this book was kind of like a self-discovery of my own personal trauma, and giving me ideas like of how it has affected me over the long term. So I ended up rating this book a 5 out of 5 because this book was very insightful to me personally, and I feel like I take a lot of like the things like that it was talking about around with me as a reminder that this is things like that have affected me. And what I really appreciated about this was there was things that I was affected by that I didn't even realize on how they affected me or in what ways until I listened to this. And so like this kind of cleared up a lot for me in terms of how I'm dealing with a lot of the things that have happened to me, you know, throughout my lifetime. So I really appreciated that kind of like introspective self-discovery of how trauma has affected me over the long term. So yes, this book was extremely well written, extremely very informative, and while it is written by a psychiatrist, it is also extremely informative on even like in a simplistic kind of way, and it takes some complex ideas also and like makes them very easy to understand. So I feel like anybody could understand this book. The next book that I read is Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. This is the very first book in this series, and I actually mainly read this for Rewind Book Club because this was an older book and I watched the movie, and to be perfectly honest with you, this is going to be kind of like a, what's the word? I can't think. Thinking's hard right now. I liked the movie better. I liked the movie better because I feel like it went like into more detail more quickly, and I probably would have gotten into more detail had I continued on with the series, but I'm probably not going to read any more of these because this was about Home for Peculiar Children. This is about basically like kids like that have come through and they have peculiar abilities that allow them to do different things, and they have to be housed like in safe houses that are on time loops. And so some of these time loops like are in different times like in history. So the one we end up visiting, I believe, is like in the early like 1900s, and the kids like that are in this have been in this time loop for a very long time. And we meet our main character who can see like these giant monsters, but nobody else can see them, and his grandfather ends up like right at the beginning of the book, this is not a spoiler because it's right at the beginning of the book, ends up dying because one of the monsters attacks. And so he ends up convincing his father to take him overseas to this like little town where he can try to figure out if the things that his grandfather was talking about, like about these peculiar children, actually exist. And so this is kind of like how he's dealing like with his trauma of his grandfather dying from this terrible monster. This, I didn't love it. Like, I thought it was okay. Like, I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars, but I didn't love it. I was not happy like with the overall plot progression. It felt very slow, and the monsters like to me like weren't like really all that scary, and I just have like the imprint of like the movie in my mind, like that was a lot more like action packed, and like it felt like there was an actual point to it and a more of a plot progression and everything else. And I did not fall in love with this first book, and I'm not impressed with it enough that I would want to continue with the series. I know some people really love this series, and no shade to you if you love it. I just didn't. It's not for me. 3 out of 5. It was intriguing. It was an experience. Won't read it again. So the next book that I read is by John Gwynne. It's Malice. This is the first book in the Faithful and the Fallen series, and this is a fantasy series that exists with giants. Giants have been kind of a portion like of this land, and a lot of the humans quite a while back came to the Banished Lands to kind of escape the giants. Well, the giants kind of started disappearing, and only recently are they starting to resurface again, and there's like a lot of things that are going on, like prophecies like that are being fulfilled. There is supposed to be like this great leader that's supposed to surface at some point, and the rocks are bleeding, and there's bandits, and there's all these creatures like that are kind of materializing out of nowhere, and there's so many things like that are going on in this. This is a huge book. There are so many characters like to follow in this, and at the beginning of this, because this is an adult epic fantasy, I was a little lost because we have so many characters to follow, and I really struggled with that because like a lot of the character names sounded very similar, so I was trying to keep all of them straight. And there are multiple viewpoints, and they all are in different portions of this world, and we're trying to follow like, you know, all the pieces of this puzzle. I think the author themselves did a very, very good job of the plot progression and the flow and a lot of the other things that are going on in this. But the beginning of this really kind of tripped me up because of all the names. And I know like that is kind of like normal for like a lot of adult fantasies, but I wish the names hadn't have been so similar, and I really struggled with that. But this is the first book in the series, so this is like the one like that we're doing a read along for. And I'm going to be reading the second book in the month of August. Really excited about that because this book really picked up at the end, and I really, really ended up enjoying this. I ended up rating this a 4 out of 5 stars because of my feelings about it towards the beginning, but I've never read a fantasy series like circulating around giants, so this is completely like new for me. And I will say like that I absolutely loved the main character Corbin in this. He was a little boy who is kind of like growing up and realizing his potential, and I feel like he's going to be like a pivotal character throughout this whole series, and I just really loved it. It was so good. It was really well written. It was very clear after like I got through like trying to memorize like all the characters, and I highly recommend it. Also, we did a live show on this very recently. I'm going to put like a little card up here. Me and my 3 other lovely co-hosts are on that particular live show. Their links are in that description of that video, so go check it out. It's going to be on one of the cards, and I do highly recommend this. This is so good. And I'm really excited to continue on with this series because there's like prophecies like that we're talking about in here, and so much character development like happened like in this one book that I'm really curious to see how much character development we get like in the next 3 books, because this is a quartet also, so I'm really excited. The last book I'm going to discuss on this video is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is a female fantasy with a sapphic romance and historic fantasy. So interesting and so good. We have our main character who is a nameless girl, and she actually like is foretold by this fortune teller like that she has absolutely no future, no possibility of success, no possibility of like anything good happening to her. And because of that, she kind of like is nameless until one night bandits come to their poor farm, and they have very like little food, and so there's bandits like are scraping for anything that they can get, just like everybody else, for something to eat, because the food is so scarce because they're so poor. And they end up killing the father, and the brother, who was speculated to have greatness thrust upon him by a fortune teller, ends up wasting away because he just becomes so like depressed and just kind of, you know, deteriorates until he's dead. So the nameless girl ends up taking on her older brother's name and goes to a monastery because her brother had been previously promised to the monastery to kind of serve and become a monk. Well, she proves herself, and she's at this monastery for a very long time, but she also has to hide her gender because these monks are solely male and females don't become monks. So she has to hide who she is as far as like sexuality goes, which is kind of interesting because we kind of see her progressing as a male through this world, because this world is very male dominated, and we see her growth and things that happen like to her, like that take her outside of the monastery. I do have a more in-depth kind of discussion about it. I did another video of this for a full review. I'm also going to link that in the cards above because it's There was just so much to say about this book. I took like 40 something pages of notes. Like I did a whole outline for this because there was just so many details. And this was another ARC that I received from NetGalley, and I read it just before it was released, and it was really, really amazing. And I love the female romance in this. Like it was so good. The female love interest, Ma, she was a tender creature of the heart, and I loved her so much. She was just so likable and so compassionate, and she really kind of emulated the weight women have to hold up in order to be the ideal partners and the ideal love interests, and the things that they had to do, like, you know, like to make sure that they secured themselves an heir. And I really, really appreciated her because, like, I feel like she was the opposite extreme from what Zoo was, our main character, because we saw Zoo having really strong masculine energy as far as like progression goes, but then we have Ma, who is very strong feminine energy, and we see like even because of that strong feminine energy and because she's openly female, she gets a lot more oppression, and she's treated more as an object, not by Zoo, but like, you know, by people in general, like seen as a status symbol. And then we also have like a General Yang, who is this very interesting, like, he basically like is a eunuch general that works for the enemy. He had everything taken away from him by the people that he's now serving. And his penis was cut off like when he was really young because they didn't want him to be able to sire any heirs to his bloodline, which is a big thing, especially like, like heritage and passing on your name and everything else. So and this Yang is very interesting also because Yang is predominantly male, but he exceeds big time female energy because he looks extremely attractive, very feminine. So like there's so many different like dynamics in like these characters, and that's one of the biggest things like that I found very intriguing about this, is because it is so different. So I really, really love this, and I ended up giving this a 5 out of 5 stars. So honestly, like I feel like July, like to sum things up, was either a month like where I really loved the book or I really didn't love it. I didn't seem to have much of a middle ground in like this month. And so that was pretty much all the books that I have read in the month of July, and I hope you guys really enjoyed this wrap up. If you guys like this video, hit the like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell icon if you guys want to receive emails every single time I post. I'm also on Amazon, Goodreads, TikTok, and Twitter. Those links are linked in the description below. I hope you guys will come join me and be my friend or whatever, you know. So thank you guys so much. I will see you guys again very soon.